Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hybrid Friends. Today we will talk a bit about backup, and as I'm not a 100% backup expert, I brought my dear old friend, or longtime friend, not old, you're not old.
Well, it depends
But
on, if you ask me now or a couple years from now, I might give you a different answer.
so, as you already said, I have Andy with me from Hornet Security. He can spell his first name himself because it's rather complicated.
Yes,
And
Syrewicze. So it
Andy,
it
introduce yourself, please.
yeah, definitely. I appreciate that, Flo. Thanks. So my name's Andy Syrewicze. So the last name sounds a lot simpler than how it's spelled. But no, I appreciate you having me on the show. So I'm a security evangelist here at Hornet Security. And you brought me on talking about backup and being an expert in backup and recovery. Even though my title is security evangelist, I am quite fluent in backup and have been dealing with backup content almost exclusively for the last 8 years now. But the last couple of years, I've kind of delved into a couple of different areas. But it's a subject I'm very, very knowledgeable about and spend a lot of time talking about. So appreciate you having me on the show.
And even if you're working for Hornet, we met at with Itaro and in the Hyper-V dojo in
Correct. Yep.
the old dark ages.
It feels like the old dark ages, that's for sure. And I'm glad you brought that up because those that aren't aware, Altero was a backup and recovery vendor, which Hornet Security purchased a couple of years ago. So that brought the Altero product set underneath the Hornet Security umbrella because, I mean, especially in like the age of ransomware that we live in, backup really kind of falls underneath that security umbrella for many organizations. So it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah, that makes perfectly sense. Even within Fast Track, we have these BCR backup recovery disaster recovery team, which is well connected, or a lot of these folks went to our security team. So it looks like a common step here. But as we both work with backups and backup customers, we are getting often asked, how should my backup look like? So how should I define my backup? And I'm sitting there, I don't know.
That's the common answer, and I guess the common IT answer that I see given, at least over here in the States, and I assume it's that way in Europe as well, is it depends, right? It depends. And I talk to a lot of customers that get frustrated by that answer because they want like a nice, easy cookie cutter answer, right? And that's just not the case with backup and recovery. And I mean, I guess if you want a more crisp answer, really what it comes down to is how your backup should look depends on your organization. What data is important to you? How much of that data are you comfortable with losing? How quickly do you need to recover that data in the event that it becomes unavailable? What's your rate of change of data? I mean, there's so many variables. It's very difficult to answer. Basic, simple answer, right?
And I think it starts first with defining your data classes, defining your data,
Yep.
as you already said, which is what data is important and what data can I lose, for example. I always say to my customers is your financial data you need to keep for, at least in Germany, for 10 years, if possible longer. But what about the meal card for the cafeteria? It's no longer relevant next week.
Right.
So,
and I think along those lines, there's one thing that's kind of been occurring in our industry over the last 10, 15 years now, 20 years, that has kind of made this question a little bit simpler for a lot of people asking that, like, hey, how do I set up my backups question? And that is compliance, right? Because there are more organizations falling underneath the umbrella of compliance somewhere. HIPAA, for example, here in the U.S., or ITAR CMMC. That's the compliance regulation that governs U.S. Department of Defense workloads. You got PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley. Again, I'm listing all the U.S. ones because those are the ones I'm most familiar with. But all of them have some sort of data retention requirement, which at least helps those organizations answer at least one of those it depends type of backup questions. And that is, how long do I have to hold on to this data for, right?
right. And then other things coming in, like where do I need to store my data? So can I keep, or I'm working with retailers and they say, okay, we have sometimes the situation, we need to store at least data for 1 day on our systems in the retail store, but afterwards we should have them in our data centers or in the cloud and ship them off the location, or ship them off location, and then have also redundant location. And as you said, that's depending on the industry I'm working in, and working with my own requirements. And let's talk about change data. So
Sure.
why do we need backup in most cases? There's, let's say, Mrs. Meyer create a document in the afternoon before closing work, and Mr. Schultz accidentally deleted it on the morning. So I think that's the, at least from my knowledge, except the worst case scenarios, is that why I got asked to get a file back from backup, or an email back from my backup, because someone accidentally deleted it within the first 24 hours.
And that's typically that's like the most common scenario, right? And that's, I mean, you go way back to when backup first became a necessity, right? And that was the initial use case. Like, okay, how do we guard against accidental deletions? And of course, as we got further along, then we had malicious deletions, ransomware, and everything else that we have to deal with in the backup space now. But that is a fantastic example, right?
And so how would you, for example, handle the question? So, should we now know it's daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. It's depending on our requirements. That's for sure. But how should I tackle? Should I always do the full backup? Should I do incremental forever, differential backups? How can I handle my storage? So I have a friend of mine is working for the Museum of Nature in Berlin, and he told me, yeah, my backup data from my few dinosaurs I have here is 2.2 petabyte.
That's all. 2.2 petabytes. Just a bit there. It's a good question, right? Is like, what is the best way of me storing my backups? And again, it comes back to that initial response of like, well, it depends. And I know people hate that answer, but again, it depends on what your end goal is. So if you just need, basic file recovery and you're okay with, I don't know, 24 hours RPO, recovery point objective, you're okay with losing maybe 24 hours worth of data, you could just do a single nightly backup of your data set and call it good. And when it comes to things like, well, do I run a full? Do I run a differential? The way that we do things in our VM backup product here at Hornet Security, for example, is the first backup is always a full. We always grab everything. And then each subsequent backup, we're just grabbing the changed blocks, right? And we do that for a number of reasons. The main reason is storage savings, because if you ran a full backup every time, your backup set would get very large very quickly. But, you bring up a good point, like, how should I be doing this? Should I be doing fulls, differentials? And I always think of the organization archive.org when I'm having this conversation, because it always comes back to what is your intended recovery case. 99% of organizations are going to just, they're going to want to conserve on storage. They're going to want to be able to do basic recoveries of virtual machines and individual files. But there are those organizations that do something a little bit more specialized. And like I said, I was thinking of archive.org. Archive.org has their backup and recovery solution. Last I read about it, I got to give that disclaimer about this. I read about this a few years ago. But last I read about this, they had they planned their data recovery in such a way that, if somebody picked up a lone hard disk off of a beach after some world-ending event, they could read the data off of it, right? So I mean, that is the extreme case that most people aren't even going to be thinking about. But my point is, you have to think about what your end goal is. If it's just basic recovery, you know, that's good, right? Because it means you're in a simplified situation, and it makes that choice a little bit easier. But again, you have to know what your end result and what your end goal is.
Yeah, maybe a good example here is I have my very critical warehouse database. When that database is not available, I cannot ship goods. I cannot do any sales, etc. So that one needs to be quickly back, or I need to recover that, let's say, within an hour or 20 minutes, or it really depends on how many money do I lose when that database is not available, versus how much money will it cost to build that recovery time objective. How many money do I want to spend? And the other worst case, coming back to my friend from the Museum of Nature in Berlin, who said, I need to back up all these data because in 10 years there could be someone finding a new skeleton of a new dinosaur or a new exotic horse or snake. So he's storing the largest snake database or repository of pictures of snakes on the globe. Said there could be someone who finds a new snake somewhere in the Amazonas and wants to know, is that already available? So I need to give him all these pictures found from snakes in the Amazonas. But there it does not count if I give them, if it takes 1 hour or a week, because he needs to come back from the Amazonas with the snake, take his pictures, talk to his other professors and people helping him on the project, and then I can send him the pictures. So I have time. I'm not, he says, I'm not talking in years, I'm talking in centuries.
Right. And again, that comes back to our key point at the beginning of this discussion is it depends. It really depends on your organization. And I think the example case that you lined out just before you mentioned, the long-term retention of like these snakes, right? The snake database is going back to that manufacturing example, or the one that I always think of is I worked for an MSP years ago, and we once had a large medical organization that, despite our persistence of telling them not to do this, they ran their entire practice management software off of a single SQL server. And I mean, this database held like CT scans and MRI scans, like these huge high resolution medical pictures, basically, right? So, I mean, this thing was not petabytes like your example, but it was still probably 50 terabytes, 60 terabytes, pretty sizable. And of course, one day that SQL box fell flat on its face, and now that practice, they can't service patients, right? Mm-hmm. And so it comes back to your example case of like, okay, how do you recover quickly? How do you architect your backups for a quick recovery? And again, using our solution as an example here is that we have a couple of different things that could help address that particular case. So you could, do very frequent backups. So like up to every 5 minutes if you wanted to. That way you could, only lose potentially 5 minutes of data. But the problem in this situation, we have a whole virtual machine that's offline. It's a huge VM. When you're talking about just recovery, just write times, you're still talking hours of recovery, right? So that's where some other backup recovery technologies come into place. And probably the feature I get most giddy about and I really like in our product set is boot from backup. So what boot from backup does is it kind of pairs a traditional recovery job with some cool infrastructure stuff. So boot from backup, what this feature does is it facilitates an iSCSI connection under the hood between your backup storage and your hypervisor. And so it connects your hypervisor to the backup storage as usable storage, and it boots a copy of that VM from whatever recovery point you define in the backup storage. Meanwhile, a recovery job starts happening in the background. And then we pair that with a differencing disk running on that hypervisor, and we boot that VM, and the users can start utilizing again. So this recovery job is slowly happening in the background, and we're capturing all of the incoming writes in this differencing disk. So we're not losing any of that data. So after that recovery operation finishes, the administrator sits down and says, like, okay, the recovery job is done. I'm going to define an outage window with my users. Like, okay, everybody log out of the practice management system. Again, in this example, he hits initiate, or he hits finalize boot from backup. It shuts down that boot from backup instance of the VM, takes all of the writes in the differencing disk, commits them to the newly shiny, nice, brand new recovered instance of that VM, and then boots it up, and away you go. So when we talk about the speed of recovery in those situations where, like, hey, I've got a system that I have to get back up right now, it's nice because you're only down as long as it takes you to realize there's a problem, and two, go through this wizard of initializing boot from backup. And then over and above that, you've got replication, which we have in our product set as well. Replication is more like that real-time replication of data between two locations, but that's a whole different discussion, right?
That's more into disaster recovery. So that's one thing also people need to understand. Backup is not disaster recovery, and backup is not RAID. So the discussion. I have a RAID, I don't need a backup. No,
I'm surprised I still hear that today, all these years later, and I'm still hearing, well, I have a RAID, I don't need backup. Well, or my other favorite along those lines is like, yeah, I've got my production SAN over there in the corner. That's where I send my backups too, so I'm fine.
Having the backup on the same system you're picking up,
probably not a great design decision. I'm just gonna go on a limb and say that.
When I was at Dell, the classic thing was, my server broke. Yep, I can ship you a new RAID controller. And where do you have your backup so that you can restore? It was on the system.
Oh no.
You know that it could be possible that the RAID controller will not recognize your disks. Bad decision. And this is the same for disaster recovery. As we discussed before, if you're in a disaster case, like the manufacturing plant, and you need to have your manufacturing plant still up and running, even if your operations room is floated. I did that in the beginning of my career. We were building a wheat mile.
Yep.
And when we were doing the production workload, one of the big tanks was exploded.
Oh no.
And yeah, we are more or less floated the whole mile with wheat and grain and everything. So the main operation room wasn't available. And what do you do in that? You cannot shut down your environment. So we needed to quickly switch into the secondary operations room, which was in another building. And it's the same for replication. If you break your systems, and if you, especially if your location is floated, there is a fire hazard, there's a tornado, whatsoever, you need to be able to switch your workloads. And that's not a backup, that's a disaster recovery.
Right. And I'm glad you brought this up because, we're talking to IT professionals, right? And we are IT professionals. And I've run into this many times where as IT professionals, we kind of get mired down in the technical details, right? From a technical perspective, how does this backup work? How does this replication work? How does this recovery work? We know the technical details, right? And I'm here to say that, like, the technical part of backup, recovery, and replication is the easy part. That is the easy part of this whole disaster recovery process. What's not so easy are all of the organizational and planning things behind that, because when you talk about disaster recovery, it's not just a technical thing. It's part of it, don't get me wrong, but that's not the only part of it. So as a business, as a leadership team, conversations and meetings need to happen where you determine as a business, these are my important data sets. These need to be replicated. These need to be set up for disaster recovery. But also think about things like, okay, if my main building becomes a smoking crater in the ground, where are my people going to work? How are we going to take phone calls? Where is my data going to live and run from? And then on the flip side of it, how are we going to fail back once the disaster is done with, right? So these are all conversations that need to happen. It's all part of it. One of our other good friends, Eric Siren, he actually wrote an ebook for us here at Hornet Security a while back called The Backup Bible. I'll give you the link so we can put it in the show notes, but it's a fantastic ebook that takes you through that whole process, provides a lot of nice checklists and things like that. You can basically go down the list and cover all of those things you need to think about, those conversations you need to have. Who are the key stakeholders that need to be brought into those conversations? It really kind of covers that whole operational and the people side of backup recovery and disaster recovery, right?
And he also talks about things like not thinking about backup, also think about your recovery and try it once in a while.
Yep, correct. Try it
Everyone
once in a while is that's fantastic advice. And I can't tell you how many organizations I've run into that are not doing some sort of regular just backup recovery testing. Just try to do a test recovery once in a while. And you can even schedule it with our software. I know most backup vendors on the market have that capability. So just schedule it and get a report. Or if you need a little bit more detail, I have some customers that actually utilize our API to, once the test restore is done, use our API to kind of reach inside the virtual machine and check a service, or see if their production database inside the test version of the recovered VM, things like that. I mean, take those steps, because the last place or the last time you want to realize that your backups are no good is when it's 2 a.m. You're holding a dead server in your hands, and that's the worst time to find out your backups are no good.
I wouldn't agree with that. It's not 2 a.m. It's mid-working hours.
That's true. That's very true. That would be the worst time. I guess I say 2 a.m. because I remember the days when I was on call and, somebody's calling me like, hey, it's broken, fix it now. And it always seemed like it was 2 a.m. for some reason. Maybe that was just me.
That brings us to one thing. So and I think it's a less frustrating question for everyone. And what I'm working at, as everyone knows, I'm working at Microsoft. And the question I always get is, what backup software do you support for, let's say, Azure Stack HCI? And I say, only our own. We're only supporting Azure Backup. We're only supporting System Center. We are not supporting anyone else. And the customer, yeah, that's not possible. You need to support the others. Nope. It's the other way around. The others need to support our platform. And maybe you can give some more insights on. So we cannot. What I'm normally saying is to those customers is, I'm Microsoft. I'm not Hornet Security. I'm not Veeam. I'm not Commvault. I'm not Dell. I'm Microsoft. I can only take responsibility for my products or for our products. I cannot take responsibility for the stuff Hornet is shipping to you. So why should I care about the others?
Yep. That's a good question. So, I mean, in terms of what we support with our backup solutions, it's really, we support a lot of different stuff. So we support Azure Stack HCI, to your point. So we are one of the backup vendors on the market that can back up workloads inside of Azure Stack HCI. We also support, the full array of Windows Server versions. I believe we go all the way back to 2012, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've looked at our supportability page. But last I knew, it went all the way back to 2012. In terms of Hyper-V, so Windows Server running Hyper-V on top of Windows Server. We can also back up VMware VMs as well. So if you've got VMware running inside of your data center, I know this is a Microsoft centric video, but we support VMware as well. In terms of other things that we can back up and protect, we also have a 365 backup application that protects Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, and Teams. That's full Teams, both the group chats and the user chats. So we can protect data that lives there. We also have a endpoint backup solution that is underneath that 365 umbrella too, because we really see the user's data as not just being 365, but also on their local endpoint too. Because I mean, despite things like known folder move and folder redirection and all those fancy things that us IT pros use, end users still just store stuff in weird places. I mean, they still somehow save stuff to the root of C despite all of our best efforts, right? So we find that endpoint backup is kind of a nice stopgap there. So, but yeah, we support a lot of different data locations, a lot of different technologies with our backup stack.
And the major reason is really here for, as a vendor, or especially as a Microsoft, we cannot support all scenarios. There are specializations, as you already said, we cannot do, because we have so many products in our portfolio that we cannot go too deep or extremely deep on specialized use cases.
Right.
And there those specialized partners can come in, and yeah, we're working closely together in a development perspective.
Yep.
But as you're so specialized, having special features, as we discussed, those need to be supported by the ones who developed it and know their stuff in and out, and that's then the partner. And
Correct.
And that's also the support statement which comes, which you already said. The partner gives support statement. We support Windows Server 2012, HCI, M365, this versions of VMware, vSphere, whatsoever. That's what we're supporting because we developed the stuff for that. And we as a Microsoft then says, okay, we have a support. We can talk to your partner if that's supported, and then we can see how we set up again the strategy and how we can implement that. Maybe storing the backup not on local disk, maybe to Azure or to a file server, whatsoever. But
Yep.
it's always coming to a partnership, and especially on the HCI docs, there's Altaro/Hornet explicitly listed as one of the preferred partners.
Yep. And we were very proud to be one of the first. I believe we were on I remember the PowerPoint slide during the HCI announcement. We were one of the very first. We were very proud of that.
In the first 4, I think.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, we've, on the backup side, we've always been a very Microsoft first type of organization. So if you go way back, again, back to the Altaro days, back when it was just Altaro VM backup, there was a time it was called Altaro Hyper-V Backup, because
I remember
we did
that.
Hyper-V first, right? And then eventually we included VMware products as well, so then it became Altaro VM Backup. But we've always been a very Microsoft-centric type of shop on the backup side. And yeah, I was very happy when I saw that we're supporting Azure Stack HCI out of the gate. So.
And as I worked with Altaro a few years, mostly with the free 2 VM version. To be honest, and it's still, or it was, and it's still an amazing product. So I will put the link below.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, in description. But I think it brings us also to the end of our conversation. As we wanted to just give a teaser on our thoughts on that conversation, and also link to the Backup Bible.
Yep, definitely. I'll get you that link so we can post it, because that's a fantastic piece of content. Hats off to Eric on that one.
Yep. And again, Eric is also an MVP or a Microsoft most very professional out from the field with putting all his field knowledge into that one. So read that one. It would definitely help. And was amazing to have you here on the show, taking that video with me, and yeah, having that amazing discussion. Hopefully, we can at some point, when Hornet is doing more for HCI, discuss also security solutions on, or
Oh, definitely.
or for the audience, just security considerations for hybrid cloud. I think would be interesting topic. So leave us a comment below if you want to see that and have the discussion with Andy here.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to that conversation, and thanks for having us on the show today, and always happy to be here.
Thank you, my friend, and then have a great day in your case. For me, it's evening here in Europe.
Right.
So
right.
see you next time.
Yep. Have a good one. Thank you.
Bye.